I think that you are wise to say that you don't know what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
The wisest man in, let's say, Western philosophy, Socrates says, I only know that I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and on both sides of this issue, so the first thing I'll say is I didn't watch that movie.
Yeah.
Some people who I think are very thoughtful and reflective who did watch it gave a description to me, and I was like, yeah, that doesn't sound credible, and it's not
Yeah.
how I'm going to spend 2 hours on a Friday night. The what I have seen happening. So, like one thing you could take from that German pathology study with the
Mm-hmm.
autopsies is only 4 out of the 35 people who dropped dead unexpectedly at home um, died because of vaccine-induced myocarditis. I
Okay.
mean, that's not completely confirmed, but it seems like the most likely explanation. So I think it's deeply irresponsible if you're on Twitter and somebody faints somewhere or has a heart attack somewhere to say this is the vaccine. They might not even have been vaccinated. So there's just a lot of deeply irresponsible claims coming out from like the sort of the old traditional anti-vaccine movement.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think they're in the medical establishment is a reflexive, like they're conspiracy theorists, they're misinformation mongers, they're very bad people. We need to censor them. And no, the vaccine doesn't kill anybody. It's perfectly safe. And it's like, well, no, hang on.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutism on both sides. I understand why they're falling into a reflexive absolutism because the
Mm-hmm.
claims made on the anti-vaccine side are irresponsible and often false.
Yeah.
But 4 out of 35 out of a population of 11 million is still not zero. So we have to be really careful to be nuanced at all times.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, no, of course, and you are extremely nuanced, and I'm just I feel like we're in the twilight zone, really. That someone as nuanced as you are has been attacked as viciously, as you've been for the last year and a half or more, and so that's going to be my next question. This recent Toronto Star story, that if you can talk about it, by Bruce Arthur, who is a sports writer but anointed as a public health expert. And ironically, he seems critical of the fact that you hadn't received specialist training for your position as acting health officer at this health unit, without having the self realization to realize he has zero training in public health. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted you to tell me what you do as a critical care physician, because do I believe a critical care physician, or do I go with what a sports writer is saying in the Toronto Star? For me, the choice is very clear. So you point to distortions and misrepresentations in his in this interview that you did with him. Could you set the record straight for us? And why do you think your views were misrepresented? What is going on here?
Um, why my views were misrepresented, I can't speak for Bruce. In fact, I would invite Bruce to explain why he did that because
Mm-hmm.
my views were misrepresented. I explained it very carefully to him. His editors must have explained it to him because they printed corrections. He went on Twitter the day after
Mm,
and kind of explained how he was right all along and made more factual errors. Um,
amazing.
I so I can't, which I called out in his replies.
Yeah.
I I can't speak for his headspace, but I think you should invite him to be on the podcast. I would love to hear. Um, More globally, socially, I think people were terrified of COVID, and there's a um, I think there was a whole swath of people who hadn't really spent a lot of time reflecting on their mortality,
Mm,
who suddenly all had to all at once. I think that this is the first pandemic we've gone through with social media, with your phone buzzing in your pocket, telling you constantly how many cases, how many deaths, is the ICU full, do we have enough
right.
ventilators? So I was a medical resident during H1N1 working in ICU, and I'm pretty sure I was working with H1N1 patients, and I had the worst flu of my life. I Nobody was interested in testing me. Public health didn't call me. The
Mm-hmm.
hospital called me every day to ask if I could come back to work yet. Like the idea, and H1N1 was particularly dangerous to people in their 20s. So I was more at risk of death back then in 2008, but hardly anyone even remembers the H1N1 pandemic. So
That's very interesting. So H1N1 was actually more deadly as far as young people were concerned. Is that?
yeah, I wouldn't be able to remember the age cutoffs. I
Yeah,
remember I did the own
yeah,
calculation for me
yeah,
as a I think I was 25 at that time,
yeah, yeah, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
in both cases, like you can, neither number is certain for the mortality risk
Mm-hmm.
because there's more cases than
Mm-hmm.
tests that are performed. But yeah, something really changed in terms of how we as a society deal with this sort of thing. And
Mm-hmm.
COVID killed far more people, no question. But I am saying the alacrity of our response was
Yeah.
terribly different, and I think social media is part of that. So I think people. Another issue is that China has been ascendant since H1N1,
Mm.
and this virus happened to start in China. Well, possibly not a coincidence. And so the first worldwide response to this pandemic was a communist authoritarian dictatorship response. And throughout in my initial commentary, I was like, hey everyone, like look at South Korea and Japan and Taiwan. They're all having really successful pandemic responses that are not playing by the Chinese Communist Party playbook. And Taiwan, for most of the pandemic, was doing better than mainland China.
Mm.
Um, but yet the World Health Organization made some statements explicitly promoting the authoritarian lockdown response. So all that taken together, I think people were just terrified. They thought this new superpower is going to teach us the proper response, and
Mm-hmm.
like get on the team. You're not on our team. You're on the team with the anti-science, anti-vaxxers. And I was like, no, I have more vaccines than most people because I've done work overseas.
Yeah.
Um, and I think it was just frank tribalism. So
Yeah.
if you're not saying the words on our team, then you must be on their team.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I interviewed recently. I interviewed Thomas Fotze. I don't know if you know of Thomas Fotze. He and his co-author have a great new book out called The COVID Consensus, and he was on my podcast recently. And he made a very interesting point to me, which I picked up from his book, and we were talking about it on the show. That the Western world really had not experienced death in this manner. There's a bureaucratization of death in our society. Sick people, dying people are sent to hospices, hospitals, long-term care homes, retirement homes, whatever. And there's a whole bureaucracy of death involved, and you're kind of hermetically sealed from all of that stuff. And so this was the first time where we were, as you say, every day getting updates, minute by minute updates about how many people died in Italy, for example. Whereas in the rest of the world, say in Asia, for example, or in India in particular, death is like an everyday part of life. You see it all the time around you.
Yeah, and frankly, as an ICU doctor, as any hospital doctor, you see it
Yeah.
every day, all the time. And I think another sort of confluence in events for why did Ontario and Canada have such draconian responses. I think our healthcare system was on its last legs pre-pandemic. I think the folks who are responsible for the catastrophe of our healthcare system in Ontario were kind of granted a 3-year excuse
Mm.
to use at all times. But in some ways, I've been, and physicians like me have been, the frog boiling in water, where things were getting worse and worse every year. I started med school 20 years ago,
Mm.
and people would be lying in stretchers in the hall back then. And every year it's been a little bit more. And I do remember in the winter of 2019 thinking, I don't even know that I want to be associated with this
Mm.
anymore. I had a 92-year-old woman who was in the hall, like it just no darkness, no privacy, no place to use the washroom, on a very uncomfortable stretcher. And her 7-year-old daughter came in and said, like, should I just take her home? And I said, frankly, you probably should. Like, she needs to be in the hospital, but
Mm.
this is inhumane and she's not going to get better here.
Yeah.
But that 92-year-old woman does not have a podcast, is not
Mm-hmm.
invited to conferences, isn't about to write a book about what happened to her, but it's awful. So by the time that you get to feel the inhumanity of our healthcare system collapsing, you're usually not in a position to make a lot of noise about it.
Yeah. Another thing that you mentioned, and it just occurred to me, is that I expected authoritarian governments around the world to really take advantage of the pandemic and really push hard on authoritarian measures of, and just use the pandemic as an excuse. I've actually seen the opposite. Like you mentioned Bolsonaro, I'll give you India as an example. Yes, the Indian government, I was actually there during the first lockdown, and they did, I think, one of the world's most draconian lockdown. It lasted for like 2 months, locking down 1.1 billion people, and it truly was like a real lockdown. You couldn't, even the hospitals were locked down, if you could believe that, for the first few days. So I just, it's perplexing. Why is it that liberal democracies like Canada, New Zealand, Australia, I mean, these are the last places on the planet that I would have thought would have gone, would have implemented these extreme measures. I mean, there are these interviews of Jacinda Ardern that are making the rounds now, where she's like saying in this, it almost sounds evil. If you don't get tested, we're going to put you in a quarantine, and you're going to be there in that quarantine facility indefinitely, basically, if you refuse to get tested for COVID. How did this happen? Like, it's a puzzle for me. I don't know if you have any thoughts about it.
I don't. I do not have a complete political theory
Mm-hmm.
on what happened. I think part of it was the extremely divisive global figure of Donald Trump.
Mm.
And as soon as Donald Trump wanted to open up, because hydroxychloroquine, I never thought it worked, but I never thought it was a public threat that we all need to censor anyone who mentions it on social media. I think the fact that Donald Trump had mentioned it at a press conference really
Mm-hmm.
motivated a lot of animosity towards it. People forget that Trump did Operation Warp Speed to get the vaccine to market faster than usual, and a number of prominent left-wing figures, including Kamala Harris, said, "I'm never taking this Trump vaccine." That was back in like November of 2020.
Mm.
So I kind of think he recalibrated. And by the way, I've never been a supporter, and at times I've been staunchly critical of Trump. I think he recalibrated the left-right divide in a totally nonsensical way a lot of the time, because of course, no, I would not have predicted that more liberal progressive places would be locking elderly people in their nursing home room
Mm-hmm.
without being allowed to go outside and see the sun for weeks/months at a time.
Yeah.
That is a deep surprise to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is, right now, where we are in the pandemic now. My sense is, and I've said this many times in several of my columns recently, that much of the advanced world, Western world, essentially seems to have moved on from the pandemic and removed all pandemic measures. Japan, of all places, last week said that COVID-19 should be treated like the flu. Yet here in Canada, we seem to be stuck in some kind of a time warp where, we're constantly being told to get vaccinated. Perhaps we should bring mask mandates in. What do you make of this disconnect, Canada versus the rest of the world? I mean, let's take Japan, for example, of highly mask compliant society, highly vaccinated, but yet the Japanese government said that we're just going to treat it like the flu now.
I think so. The first part of my answer might be a second part to the last question.
Yeah.
There's this important book by a political theorist named James Burnham called The Managerial Revolution, where he was explaining like the 20th the big conflict in the 20th century between the far right, i.e. fascism, and the far left, i.e. communism, is going to be won, and he was not happy about this, by managerialism, by the ascendance of this professional managerial class, the laptop class, the Davos set, the people who claim to be much smarter than everyone else, and they'll just run things in this sort of technocratic fashion, and
Yeah.
you'll be happy with whatever they come up with, because obviously they know better than you whether you should have your prom or your wedding or your dad's funeral. And I think Canada very, very heavily subscribed, at least the government and the bureaucracy of Canada. Of course, the bureaucracy does it. It is a bureaucratic philosophy, and it's very centered in Ottawa, which I think is why the trucks went there. So I think
Mm-hmm.
that's part of why we're seeing it so heavily in Canada. The other issue in Canada is actually two more issues. One, for some reason, we have very strongly tied our national identity to a healthcare system that isn't good.
Mm.
In all of the rankings of OECD countries and their healthcare systems, we're always second last, but at least we're beating the United States, which is the elephant in the room, and that's all we really care about. So we've come to take great pride in our ability to do healthcare here, even though it's not that good, and it's an unfortunate myth that we can't let go of. And I had one other. And we don't have a functioning media, which I know you're able to talk about with more depth than I am. But if often political figures, and I'll name the Prime Minister, Trudeau, would say we're doing this trucker
Mm.
mandate because that's what the science shows. And
Mm.
I was just flabbergasted, going like, will one of these journalists in the scrum say, which scientific paper are you quoting, Prime Minister? You don't just get to say the science supports my policy.
Right.
Somebody say which science, please.
Yeah. Well, that has never happened. And I've, as really an outsider in journalism, I've commented on this many, many times. Like, I'm not at these press conferences, but maybe I should start going to them, if I get the time. But the point is, I would have asked that question, like, what is this based on? Why, where are you, how are you implementing this policy? What's the science here? Yet we were told, follow the science, follow the science. And, but the end result really is that, we've created a great distrust in public health, wouldn't you say?
Um, I think that's true. I don't know of a scientific way to answer that question. I do maybe know one. I know that a lot of figures in public health have said you
Mm-hmm.
need to get your toddlers vaccinated against COVID. And at Ontario currently, 4% of toddlers have received 2 doses of vaccine against COVID. So that it stands to reason that 96% of parents of toddlers aren't buying these recommendations currently.
Mm.
Um, and 2 years ago, I think that they would have been lining up in droves
Mm.
to follow that advice. So
Yeah.
yes, I think there quite obviously has been an erosion of public trust. Um, it and some of that's going to be terribly detrimental. Like, if you're not careful, if you're not nuanced, if you've said things that turned out to be ridiculous or untrue, which certain public health figures in Canada have at certain times, I don't want to call out names,
Mm-hmm.
that's going to diminish public trust. And it should. But there are terrible, drastic downsides to that. Currently, we don't know in Ontario what percentage of the population and the young population is vaccinated against polio. That's a
Yeah.
really, really bad problem because polio can be absolutely devastating for children, and the vaccine is 99% effective for life at preventing you from getting it. And I know kind of anecdotally that there
Mm-hmm.
are a lot of folks who, in addition to not believing public health about the COVID vaccines, are not believing public health about the traditional vaccines that we have 70 years of safety data on, and we know how good they are, and that's a big problem.
Yeah. Well, Matt, I know you're very busy, and but one final question for you on a personal note. You've very courageously taken on these positions right from the beginning of the pandemic, and of course, you've taken a lot of heat. I'm sure it hasn't been easy for you and your family, but when you look back on all of this now, you've basically been proved right, and what's more, you have the health district that you were in charge of, seeing a 30% lower mortality from COVID than the provincial average. Do you feel a sense of vindication that it was all worth it? And if in hindsight, if you knew in hindsight, how much heat you were going to take for challenging the establishment and and this group think out there, would you have still done the same things? Would you have approached things differently?
Yes, absolutely. And I've just been continually surprised
Yeah.
by the blowback. In some ways, this is not I'm not living in the society that I thought I was living in. I thought we cherished evidence, cost benefit analysis, freedom of speech, hashing it out, having a friendly argument, like we
Mm-hmm.
can agreeing to disagree. These like very basic civil society ethos, or this very basic ethos. I'm so perplexed that it's not the case. But at no point could I have done any other. Like, there's the Elon Musk quote: if nobody makes the stuff, there won't be any stuff. If
Mm-hmm.
nobody criticizes bad policy, there will not be any good policy. So
Yeah.
it's been this weird tightrope to walk between saying the most true thing and saying the most effective thing. And I frankly have a lot of sympathy for public figures who maybe I was critical of 3 years ago, where I now understand that you can't say everything that you have to say in public life on day one, because then there will be no day two. You have to kind of meet the public where they are at, what they're ready to hear. But you always have to be pushing towards truth and reason, or else we're not going to have truth or reason. Like my family are refugees from former Yugoslavia, and they fled because they were starving and being politically persecuted. And that can happen here. It won't happen here because we're going to speak out, and we're winning. But it's
Mm-hmm.
not speaking out is not an option.
Well, yeah, it's definitely not an option for me. Even if I tried, I mean, I just can't find it in me to not speak up, and it's a good thing and a bad thing, I think, both at the same time. But I'm so glad that you're speaking up, Matt, and that you have been speaking up for all of us during the pandemic, and it's been such a great privilege and honor to have you on the show, and and also that you'll join us again sometime soon, and hopefully we'll have other things to talk about other than COVID-19.
I hope that so much, and I just want to say you're a hero of mine, and I will always come when you call.
Oh, thank you, Matt. Real pleasure. Thanks. Take care.